The first light of dawn crept over the rolling hills of Redstone, Montana, casting a golden sheen across the prairie that stretched boundless and unbroken to the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the faint tang of iron from the railroad tracks that sliced through the heart of this small town. At the edge of Redstone stood the depot, a weathered wooden structure with peeling paint and a sagging roof, its platform worn smooth by years of hopeful arrivals and reluctant departures. Each morning, as the world stirred awake, a lone figure could be seen leaning against the depot's wall, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. Caleb Thornton, a cowboy with a heart as stubborn as the land he called home, had made this ritual his own. For 3 months, he'd come here, his boots scuffing the same boards, his eyes fixed on the tracks that disappeared into the distance, waiting for her. Caleb was a man of few words, his face carved by sun and wind into lines that told stories he'd never speak aloud. At 27, he was lean and wiry, his hands calloused from years of roping cattle and mending fences on the sprawling double-bar ranch. His hat, a battered Stetson, sat low over his brow, shielding eyes that were a deep, searching blue eyes that had seen too much of the world's hardness to believe in easy promises. Yet here he was, day after day, defying the whispers of doubt that crept into his mind like the chill of early morning. He waited for Eliza, the woman who'd stolen his heart 2 summers ago and left him with the promise that tethered him to this step hole like a lifeline. It had been a chance meeting, the kind that felt like fate but could just as easily have been forgotten. Eliza's family had been passing through Redstone, their wagon limping along with a broken axle, when Caleb, then a ranch hand with more grit than sense, had stopped to help. He'd been riding back from a long day of herding strays, his horse kicking up dust, when he'd seen the family stranded on the rutted trail. Eliza had stood apart from the others, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, her green eyes sharp with a mix of frustration and curiosity. She'd watched him work, handing him tools with a quiet competence that made him smile despite himself. By the time the axle was fixed, they traded stories, hers of a life in Chicago, his of the open range, and something unspoken had sparked between them. When her family moved on, she'd pressed a scrap of paper into his hand, her address scrawled in elegant script. "Write to me," she'd said, and he had. The letters started slowly, tentative at first, like two people testing the strength of a rope before trusting it to hold their weight. Caleb's words were clumsy, his handwriting uneven, but he poured himself into them, describing the way the stars looked over the prairie, the ache of a long day's work, the dream of a life that wasn't just him and the endless horizon. Eliza's replies were different, vivid, full of life, her words painting pictures of bustling streets, crowded theaters, and a world so unlike his own. Yet there was a thread of longing in her letters, a yearning for something simpler, something real. Over time, their words grew bolder, their promises more certain. She'd written of leaving the city behind, of building a life with him in Redstone, where the air was clean and the sky was big enough to hold all their hopes. Her last letter, received 3 months ago, had been smudged with ink and urgency. "I'm coming, Caleb. Wait for me at the depot." Those words had burned themselves into his heart, and he'd clung to them like a man lost in a storm. But 3 months was a long time to wait, and Redstone was not a town kind to dreamers. The townsfolk had noticed Caleb's daily vigil, and their whispers followed him like shadows. "That cowboy's waiting on a ghost," Old Man Tucker had said one evening at the saloon, his voice rough with whiskey and skepticism. "City girl like that, she ain't coming back to this dust bowl." Others were kinder, their pity softer but no less cutting. Mrs. Harrow, who ran the general store, would press a cup of coffee into Caleb's hands when he stopped by, her eyes soft with unspoken questions. "You sure she's worth all this, Caleb?" she'd ask once, her voice gentle but probing. He'd only nodded, his jaw tight, and walked away. He didn't owe them explanations. He didn't owe them anything but the work he did, the cattle he drove, the fences he mended. But in the quiet of his bunkhouse at night, when the stars pressed close and the world felt too big, he wondered if they were right. Had Eliza changed her mind? Had the city's pull been stronger than her promise? The questions gnawed at him, but he pushed them down, burying them beneath the stubborn hope that kept him coming back to the depot each morning. This morning was no different, or so it seemed. The air was cool, the sky streaked with clouds that promised rain by midday. Caleb hitched his horse, a sturdy bay named Rusty, to the post outside the depot and took his usual spot against the wall. His coat was worn at the elbows, his boots scuffed from months of pacing the platform. He adjusted his hat, the brim casting a shadow over his face, and let his gaze settle on the tracks. The train was due at 6:15, a schedule as reliable as the sunrise, and already he could hear the faint rumble in the distance, like the heartbeat of the land itself. His pulse quickened, as it always did, a mix of hope and dread that had become as familiar as the feel of reins in his hands. He didn't let himself imagine her stepping off the train, and not anymore. The disappointment of empty platforms had taught him to guard his heart, to hold his expectations as tightly as he held his horse's lead. The train's whistle pierced the quiet, sharp and mournful, and Caleb straightened, his hands flexing at his sides. The locomotive rounded the bend, its black iron bulk shuddering as it slowed, steam hissing like a living thing. The platform vibrated beneath his boots as the train came to a stop, its doors creaking open to release a handful of passengers. Caleb's eyes scanned each one, his breath catching in his throat. A merchant in a stiff suit stepped down first, his briefcase swinging as he hurried toward town. Next came a woman with a crying child, her face weary as she juggled a bag and the toddler's flailing arms. A drifter followed, his clothes patched and his satchel slung over one shoulder, his eyes darting as if he expected trouble. Caleb watched them all, his heart sinking as the platform emptied. The conductor called out, his voice clipped, and the train began to move again, its wheels groaning against the rails. Another morning, another empty platform. He turned away, the familiar ache settling into his chest. Rusty snorted softly, as if sensing his mood, and Caleb reached out to pat the horse's flank. "Just you and me again, old boy," he muttered, his voice low. He untied the reins, ready to head back to the ranch, when a sound stopped him, a voice, soft but clear, cutting through the morning like a bell. "Caleb." He froze, his hand still on the reins, his breath caught somewhere between hope and disbelief. He was afraid to turn, afraid it was another trick of his mind, like the times he'd thought he'd seen her in the crowd only to find a stranger's face. But the voice came again, softer this time, trembling with something that sounded like relief. "Caleb, it's me." Slowly, he turned, his boots scuffing the dirt. There, on the platform, stood Eliza. Her auburn hair was pinned loosely, strands catching the sunlight like threads of fire. Her dress was simple, a pale blue that made her eyes stand out, bright and green and full of something that looked like fear and love intertwined. A single valise sat at her feet, its leather worn but sturdy, a testament to the journey she'd made. She was real, not a ghost, not a dream, but flesh and blood standing 10 feet away, her hands clasped tightly as if to keep herself from falling apart. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to hold its breath, the wind stilling, the depot silent but for the faint creak of the platform under her weight. Caleb's mind raced, 1,000 questions colliding with the simple truth of her presence. She was here. After 3 months of waiting, of doubting, of holding on to a promise that felt more fragile with each passing day, she was here. He crossed the distance in 3 strides, his boots thudding against the wood, his heart pounding so loud he thought it might drown out everything else. He stopped just short of her, close enough to see the faint freckles across her nose, the way her lips trembled as she smiled. "You waited," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was wonder in it, and guilt, and something deeper that he couldn't name. "Every damn day," he replied, his voice rough with the weight of those mornings, the endless hours of hope and heartbreak. He didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was here, but suddenly she was in his arms, her warmth pressed against him, her head tucked against his chest. She smelled of lavender and train smoke, a combination so uniquely her that it made his throat tighten. Her arms wrapped around him, fierce and sure, and he felt her shudder, as if she'd been holding herself together for too long and could finally let go. "I'm sorry it took so long," she murmured, her words muffled against his coat. "There were broken bar things I had to settle. Family, obligations. But I'm here now." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling, and it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "You're here," he said, as if saying it aloud would make it more real. That's all that matters. The platform was empty now, the train long gone, but Caleb didn't care. The townsfolk could talk, could whisper their doubts and their pity, but none of it mattered. Eliza was here, her hand in his, her valise at his feet, and the depot, once a place of endless waiting, was now the place where his life began anew. He took her bag in one hand, her hand in the other, and led her toward Rusty, the prairie stretching out before them like a promise kept at last.